Alright boys, welcome back to my channel. Today we're taking a quick look at each tech tree or each naval tech tree in War Thunder. This is a more laid back casual video. I've not got a script. So yeah, I've just been in the garden doing about 2 hours worth of moved about 2 tons of soil. Gonna turf my garden next week hopefully. And now we're on the wonderful game of War Thunder, famous for being relaxing and not stressful whatsoever. So let's just jump straight into it with the Americas, that's a funny word, with the Americans. So what is the coastal like for Americans? Well, coastal is one of the areas for the Americans where they kind of get screwed over a little bit. Without jumping the gun too much, they basically have nothing that really stands out, at least when it comes to the larger frigates. You do have the LCS, which is fantastic, but as we're just starting out, we get quite a lot of PT boats, which stands for Patrol Torpedo. They were just used for like going around tropical islands and firing torpedoes at people. You can't really get... This is probably the best vehicle to troll with. It's the only PT boat in the game which gets basically anti-ship missiles. They're not actually anti-ship missiles. They're ground-to-air or sea-to-air missiles, I guess you'd call them. The RIM 24As. Very, very good for taking out other frigates and very early destroyers. You only get 2 of those missiles, so you do want to sit in a cap zone. Battle rating 4.0, it is pretty good. It's alright. The thing is though, this Douglas is just the same as the USS Asheville here, except this doesn't get any missiles. Instead, just having one 40mm Bofors, and the good old 3-inch 50, I believe. Oh yeah, 3-inch 50. So a lot of the American coastal vessels aren't very they don't really stand out. Let's say that there's nothing as big and scary that you find in the Soviet tech tree. And the torpedoes aren't really that amazing. If you can buy this off the Guardian Marketplace, it is very good for, I think it used to be called Kennedy's PT boat or something like that. The Thunderbolt is the one that you can still get, I believe, at 3.0. It's still pretty decent, but it's nowhere near as good as PT 811. So what about destroyers? And this is where the US tech tree really does shine, in my opinion. So in rank 1, it's nothing amazing, I'll be honest with you. But as soon as you get to rank 2, you got stuff like the Sumner, the Gearing. These are the interwar American destroyers. They were, in real life, they were the first destroyers, I believe, to use small tube boilers, which gave them incredibly good top speed. But if we take a quick look at an average American destroyer, this is the USS Gearing. I think it's the same as the Frank Knox, but a different subclass. First thing to mention is that this does get anti-fragmentation armor. This is basically the same as a spall liner in a tank, except, well, most armor on a ship is mounted externally, but this is mounted just behind the structural steel. And basically just like a big, well, it's anti-fragmentation armor, basically a spall liner. Most destroyers don't get this though. This means that high explosive rounds aren't going to do anywhere nearly as much damage against American destroyers as they are against something like a British or a Soviet destroyer. The other thing to mention is that the guns of the US destroyers all get the late war ammunition, even though the USS Gearing, well, this model is 1945, but I believe these ships were first made in like before World War II. But basically, the second rank destroyers are basically late war modifications. You have the like 1944 high explosive variable time fuse, which makes it incredibly good all-round protection. Even if an American destroyer doesn't have, say, the best anti-aircraft armament, if it doesn't have the best anti-aircraft armament, something like the Moffett, which is, it is incredibly good at its anti-surface role. But when it comes to anti-aircraft capabilities, you've just got some Oerlikons and some Chicago typewriters, I believe they're called, slang. But because you've got these fantastic high explosive variable time fuse shells, it doesn't matter. You just switch to this ammunition and just aim vaguely at the enemy aircraft and you're going to shoot it out the sky. The only downside is that these early war destroyers, they do not have the full multi-purpose turrets. The guns will only rise to 35 degrees, whereas something like a late war Frank Knox here, you can see that the guns elevate to around 85. So these are like your true late war design destroyers where you've got fantastic... These were basically designed when the destroyers were like, we're just for basically protecting convoys and aircraft carriers, really. So that is probably the that is basically, there's no downsides to American destroyers. They're incredibly good. They've got a very high rate of fire with those 5-inch 38 cannons. Basically, take your pick. They're all pretty good. The Moffat is kind of the thing that gets dragged up now. So this thing, basically every match at 4.7 is going to be 5.0. So you need to be prepared for facing big and heavier armoured opponents, such as like light and heavy cruisers. But even with the 5-inch 38, you have a very good semi-armor piercing round, 150mm of penetration. So at the rather short battle ranges in War Thunder, you can just spam semi-armor piercing at light and heavy cruisers and still do a lot of damage. You're basically just going to set them on fire and kind of all that other good stuff. One of the downsides though of the early ranks is that you don't really have the best cruisers. You have such as the Omaha class cruisers, which are, I believe they were made in the 19 early 20s, like 1922 or something. Basically, Congress removed all the funding for the US Navy, as the Congress used to do after World War II. So, post World War I, the Americans had no money for ships, so they decided we're just going to get some new light cruisers. And we're not basically going to modernize anything else until near World War II. So the Americans built the Omahas. These have got lots of 6-inch guns mounted forward. You can tell that they're like a World War I design. Got your 4-stacker. Basically just like a big Clemson. Can't remember, or not the fire. I can't remember the other class. There was 2 destroyers that the Americans spammed. You've got a lot of frontal firepower. If you're sailing directly towards an enemy, you've basically got 6-inch guns here. But it's quite weird how they have it in, like, some of them are casements and then some of it are in a turret. These aren't really the best light cruisers. Not really that fast. Not really the best armored or best protected. And they sit at battle rating 5.0. If you're lucky enough to have the USS Detroit, I don't know how you pronounce it really. It's a very good ship. It's just not as good as the destroyers. The destroyers are faster, they've got faster firing guns. Even though they're 1 inch smaller in diameter, you can just do a lot more damage using the destroyer guns rather than the light cruisers. Kind of the same thing for the American light and heavy cruisers. There's nothing really too good to say about basically any heavy cruiser in the American tech tree, apart from maybe the Des Moines or the Baltimore, the late war cruisers, which basically were getting up to 20,000-ish tons. These early treaty compliant cruisers, which were aiming to be under 10,000 tons, they kind of had some issues, to put it mildly. I believe the Pensacola's, these things, they designed it to have basically 9 8-inch guns. No, they designed it to have 12 9-inch guns. But when they came to actually mounting this forward turret, they realised that the ship wasn't actually wide enough to take the barbette, or this thing here. So they had to reduce it. Basically, the Washington Naval Treaty was a waste of time, really. It did prevent World War II, I guess, 20 years beforehand between Britain and America. But it really did hamper basically all of the ships in the world. But Britain and America could have had incredibly cool ships World War II, but they basically shot themselves in the knees. I mean, it did prevent World War II, as I say, between Britain and America, but I think it would have been cool to have some nice, bigger ships. Another L for the Americans is the early dreadnoughts. The North Dakota, I believe, was the first. Unlike HMS Dreadnought that we'll cover in the British territory, the American ship was still using triple expansion engines, which doesn't really matter too much in game, but it doesn't have anywhere close to the top speed of the Dreadnought. So this thing, despite having pretty decent armor protection, 10 inches on the belt, it's alright for 6.3, but you're going to be facing 7.0 super Dreadnoughts at that battle rating. So it is quite rough playing the early Dreadnoughts, especially as the guns only fire every 40 seconds, I believe, which is a big kick in the balls, to be honest. It's not the best whatsoever. Recently though, Guardian has been adding stuff like the USS Roanoke, which you see I've got a test drive for. This thing basically has post-war auto-firing cannons. Instead of using interrupted screw breaches, which is common in like the early and late mid-war, where you kind of like screw the breach in a little bit, These things basically used sliding breech blocks which are found on modern tanks. This increased the rate of fire dramatically. But like in the interwar period before World War II, we had a nasty habit of guns exploding or gas leaking from the blocks and, let's say, giving the crew members in the turret a very hot and gaseous surprise. So that wasn't really done, but the Americans figured it out post World War II. And then they made ships like the Roanoke and the Des Moines with rapid firing 6 and 8 inch guns. As you get to rank 6 though, the American capital ships generally are pretty good. The USS Mississippi is probably the best at the minute. It's got the 14 inch 50 or 50 caliber guns, giving it one of the highest penetrating rounds in the game now. It's been surpassed recently by the IJN Mutsu, but it's still an incredibly good ship. You also have the Texas, Arizona, and Nevada, which are all, I believe they're basically all standard class battleships, kind of. They've all basically got the same speed, firepower, and armor protection. They're all pretty much using the 14 inch 45 caliber gun, which is pretty decent. The only downside with the American battleships is the reload of 40 seconds, which is horrific, especially compared to the king of the waves at the minute, which is the Mutsu, which has 16 inch guns but fires every 20 seconds. So in an American battleship, it's very rough. The Nevada is quite good because you get capital grade firepower, but you can also spam your 5 inch 38 and set people on fire. But to be general though, lads, and being quite frank, at the minute I wouldn't really go past the destroyers for the Americans. The destroyers are the absolute kings of the waves at 5.0 and 4.7. So if you get yourself the Moffat, the Phelps, or maybe you get yourself the Moffat, the Davis on something like the Frank Knox, these 3 ships are basically the kings of War Thunder at the minute, at least at like 5.0, 5.3. So I wouldn't really go anything past this. Definitely don't buy the Arkansas. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the Americans. Let's look at the German. Alright, so looking at the German coastal fleet, and again, like the Americans, the early ones aren't particularly amazing in my opinion. You do have some very fast ships, like the this thing, the V990. This is actually not German, this is a Soviet design, but it was used by the East German navies. It has the 53-65 torpedoes, which if you can see, the maximum speed in water is 126 kilometers per hour, the fastest torpedoes in the game, and they've got a decent 300 kilo warhead as well. This vehicle is also very fast with 89 kilometers per hour going forwards. I'm guessing that's around 35 knots, 40 knots, something like that. So this is one of the standout vehicles in the German tech tree. It only gets 2 torpedoes rather than the conventional 4, but it's still a fantastic ship in my opinion. You also get these weird things called anti-aircraft ferries. It's basically just a floating raft, I guess. Not very fun to use whatsoever. They used to be incredibly overpowered when Gaijin first added naval vessels. These were like the biggest vessels that you could find. But now with all the destroyers and the big boats like this, the Cones, the Lübecks, you just get dicked on using this thing, so I wouldn't worry about getting this at all. Same for all of the AFD3. These are basically just, they're like, what's the word for it now? Like amphibious transports, basically, that they've put guns on. There's a proper word for it, I can't remember what it's called. It's kind of like a mobility vehicle that they just welded guns onto it. It's not very good whatsoever. The M17 is pretty decent. This is more like a sub-chaser or a corvette. Basically a civilian vessel with guns again put on it. It's not got the best damage output, but it's got good survivability because it's obviously a lot larger than something like a torpedo boat. We then graduate onto something like the Jaguar. These were actually used in World War II, and if you know about, the British did a raid on a French port. I can't remember what it's called now, but basically the Germans came out and met them with these things, and the British actually beat them back, even though the Jaguars outnumbered them quite significantly. I can't remember what the raid is called. It was very successful though. Britain sailed a destroyer into a port, rammed a dock gate, and then the destroyer blew up with like 2 tons of TNT in the bow. Very cool. One of the things that no one really remembers about World War II because Britain didn't really do anything epic. But we did just like these random, incredibly successful special forces operations that no one seems to remember. Everyone just remembers us for being humiliated, really. especially in East Asia, but let's not talk about that. Anyway, moving onwards, there are some other things like the Pfeil. This thing again has some very good torpedoes, 84 kilometers per hour with 320 kilos of TNT. Not as fast as the 5365s, but you get 4 of them. And the Pfeil is also a pretty decent boat in itself. I believe this thing maybe has good torpedoes as well. No, that's the German torpedoes. That would suck. You also have the Cone. This is basically a copy. Well, the Lübeck is a copy and paste of the Cone. The Lübeck is probably one of the most overpowered ships Guardian ever added, but it is an event reward. You can't get it anymore unless you buy it for a significant price on the Guardian marketplace, but it is well worth the money if you want to bully coastal vessels. You then also have the PR-206 or Project 206. This thing, it's not got the best damage output in terms of hurting destroyers, but it's got 4 decent torpedoes, which aren't as fast as the 65s. They're basically the earlier models. They still go 93 kilometers per hour, which is very good. But these are basically twin 30mm cannons, so against any other PT boat, they absolutely rip them to pieces. But if you go against anything with armor, such as a destroyer, or even some of these like corvettes that I mentioned here, you can't really damage them. So it's got fantastic potential to bully stuff like this and this. But against something like a Lübeck, even the M802, you're not really going to be able to do much damage with the Project 206. Lost World War I and were forced to destroy their naval, basically entire naval infrastructure. They kind of lost the interwar modernization. So the Germans still had 2 classifications. They had torpedo boat and basically a destroyer, I guess, really. So you have stuff like the Lux, which is a very small vessel which carried torpedoes. Basically, these were designed to go very fast and into an enemy's fleet and then fire torpedoes. And then you had the larger torpedoes, which were slower. Basically didn't carry as many torpedoes, but focused more on heavy firepower. And that is a reoccurring theme in the German destroyers. And that is basically, just like the tanks, they over-engineered the absolute living hell out of them. As you can see, these guns have 128mm guns. They're not that different, really. You've got that on. Stuff like this is the one I'm looking for, the Z25. These things have 6-inch guns on them, basically the same as a light cruiser. The Germans, absolutely massive ships, 3,500 tons. Most British destroyers at this time were weighing like 1,850, something like that. That's 2,300. That's 1,400. So the Germans basically said, screw it. That's not Germany. This is Germany. The Germans basically said, screw it, we're going to make absolutely massive torpedo, destroyer boat kind of things. So it's like very, very large, very big guns, rather slow rate of fire. But they're quite hard to kill really, because you've got such a large vessel with quite a big crew count as well. The downside though, well, the downside in real life is that they were horribly over-engineered, incredibly unstable ships in rough water. They had a tendency to basically turn over in rough seas, especially if they had low fuel. But most of the German destroyers are going to have large caliber guns with slow rates of fire, but they do have quite powerful shells, good semi-armor piercing rounds, not as good as the American ones, and they certainly don't have the American rate of fire. The German destroyers aren't really known in game as being that great, usually due to the rate of fire being so low. Another thing about having the large caliber guns is that you only get, on this ship, you only get 4 of them. So it is quite easy to knock out all the firepower of these ships, especially from the front. If this cannon gets knocked out, then you have no real other way of returning fire. Moving on to the light cruisers, and again, it's not great for the Germans. You have the Emdens, which were absolutely awful in real life. They didn't really do too much in the war apart from getting sunk. They had same guns as found on the destroyer, the 15-inch cannons. Not particularly amazing, to be honest. You then had the World War II Kolns, or the Leipzig class. I can't remember what class it is. Is it a Leipzig Cone class? That's a Leipzig class. I thought the Cone was the... Oh, anyway. Carl's K class. Okay. So basically, these ships are quite funky because they have offset turrets. As you can see here. This means if you are like this turret can rotate all the way around. So you can basically have pretty good firing angles from either side. But it means in a full broadside, it does mean that one gun will have to turn fully. These ships were basically made as merchant raiders, so the main guns are at the back for obviously running away. They can still shoot 6 of their 9 guns at you, whereas if you had another turret super firing here, you'd have to be facing someone to fire at them. And because these were basically designed to harass merchants and then run away at high speed, they have the guns on the back so they can return fire even when they are trying to evade a pursuit. Again, these ships basically did nothing in World War II apart from getting sunk. Again, they had a habit of not really liking open oceans, famously not being able to keep up with stuff like the Scharnhorst or the Tirpitz in rough weather. And in War Thunder, they aren't very good either as well. Don't buy the Karlsruhe, it's not very good. The guns also really aren't amazing. You do get armor piercing, which isn't really amazing to be honest, but the fire rate isn't too good. The Kolns in general. German light cruisers aren't very good whatsoever. Then come on to the heavy cruisers, and this is where Germany arguably gets a resurgence, basically because they completely over-engineered the destroyers. So the Prinz Eugen, which is the premium, this is 18,000 tons, basically like a mini battleship really. It's incredibly inefficient design, very, very bad armor layout, but in War Thunder it is quite survivable. You've got quite a lot of stuff, but if you look, torpedoes are just arranged everywhere randomly. The secondary battery and the anti-aircraft battery are different, which makes it it's a very inefficient design, quite like a lot of the other German vehicles really. Everyone says that Germany had great engineering, but a lot of it was just completely over-engineered and inefficient really. All of the German Navy was incredibly overweight compared to Allied equivalents, with only the Russians really being worse than the Germans. You do also get the Admiral Graf Spee. This is the Deutschland class battleship, famous for getting blown the fuck out by the Norwegians, and then getting destroyed by the British at the River Plate as well. They basically have very little armor, 80mm. I think they've got good internal protection as well though, kind of like a battleship bulkhead layout, which makes it quite hard to actually sink them if you are in like a light cruiser or a destroyer. But the star of the show is obviously going to be our 11-inch guns, which do have some pretty potent armor-piercing rounds, 540mm at point-blank range. Very impressive for 5.7. And we also get some semi-armor-piercing rounds with just under 17 kilos of TNT filler, which makes it very, very powerful. The only downside being we only have 6 guns in total in 2 turrets. So again, you can knock these turrets out pretty easily as you do only have 140mm of protection. So from the front, pretty much any light or heavy cruiser gun can go straight through these and knock out the turret. The barbette, again, only 125mm thick, just under 5 inches. So it is very, very like a glass cannon. Moving on to the battleships though, or I guess the battle cruiser, the Von der Tann. Pretty fast ship. It's a World War I vessel, the first true German battle cruiser. It does have good coal bunker protection, if we take a look here, which makes it quite hard to actually penetrate the enemy's internals, especially at close range. Your best thing really, well, a good way to kill these is with plunging fire, as you don't really have anything on here. They don't really have the thickest deck protection either, as you can see, only 25mm. They may have some more internal protection, still only 25mm, not the best. But they've got good 11-inch guns, I believe. 283mm, they should be. Yeah, there we go. 11-inch guns, they're pretty decent. Same guns found on the first German dreadnoughts as well. Well, the Westfalen is. The Helgoland has 12-inch cannons. A little bit better performance, but not amazing. Not even as good as the Admiral Hipper's armor-piercing rounds. These only have 520mm of penetration. The true star of the German territory, though, is of course the Scharnhorst. In-game, this is classed as a battle cruiser, but in real life it was a battleship. Again, the Germans just didn't really engineer it that great. This is displacing just under 40,000 tons. Very, very... it's a big ship for a battle cruiser, Guardian. I don't know why you called it a battle cruiser. I don't think Guardian really knows ship classifications all that well. So the reason that this ship only has 11-inch guns is because that's all the Germans knew how to make. They didn't have any designs for large caliber guns, because all of the World War I naval engineers were dead or retired. So they were basically, they had no 15-inch guns ready when these things were produced. So they were developing one though, because obviously the Tirpitz and Bismarck used 15-inch guns, but these were never designed to take them. They would have had to have modernizations to put 3 twin 15-inch gun turrets in, but at the time of their design, they were only designed to use 11-inch guns, because that is all they had. In game though, the Scharnhorst is a very good vessel, very good protection, good bulkheads, and it does have good firepower as well. This ship isn't really great at long range though, as it does only have 11-inch guns. You want to use the ship's fantastic survivability and good mobility, get close to the enemy, get in between some like some islands to try and get yourself close to the enemy, and then ambush people, let them come around a corner, and then when they're at close range, your 11-inch guns are more than good enough to penetrate enemies at close range. And that is basically how you play the Scharnhorst, arguably one of the best ships at top tier. Then have stuff like the Bayern and the Saxon, as well as they added a new event vehicle recently, but I don't have it. The Bayerns were the last ships that the Germans produced in World War I, and they are pretty decent in War Thunder. They've got 15-inch cannons, the 380mm PSGR, pretty decent overall penetration, not that efficient really, only 55mm more penetration than the 11-inch guns on the Deutschland class, so quite inefficient, but it's got good survivability, good armor protection, still using turbines I believe, but I think it was still coal powered, so they never could get very high top speeds, because basically the men in the low parts of the ship shoveling coal, they basically couldn't keep it up. You basically had to throw like a ton of coal in every couple of minutes, which basically absolutely tired out your coal people, which meant basically the British were using oil fired boilers at this point, and basically that doesn't matter, you just push a lever and lets more oil in. Whereas the coal powered ships, you had to have men physically throwing coal into the furnaces, I guess, or not the boilers, furnaces, I don't know. Anyway, we're getting sidetracked with real life lore and War Thunder. Anyway, German tech tree, good battleships, mediocre destroyers, terrible light cruisers. That being said, let's move on to the Soviet Union. Alright, welcome to the Russians. So the Russians are best described as heavy firepower. A lot of these early coastal vessels aren't particularly amazing. The G5 is pretty decent, which is well, I guess you've got this thing as well. I believe this thing only gets a Dushk, whereas this gets a Shavak, a 20mm cannon instead. Pretty fast vessel, good torpedoes as well. Pretty fast for battle rating 1.0. Good for... They're basically just good for running around. They're quite small, hard to hit. They're a pretty decent investment if you want to just get started or test naval out, see if it's for you. A lot of these other coastal vessels though are mainly... They were used like for sailing down rivers and just shooting at Germans. You can see that this thing uses the T-34 turret, as the Russians were very desperate during the early part of World War II. Well, the early part of World War II where they sided with the Germans. They weren't really doing too badly, as they were getting lots of money from German purchases of minerals. The Soviets were basically helping... The Soviets were helping the Germans bypass the British blockades, which no one in Russia likes you bringing up anymore. But after World War II, after the Germans invaded Russia, the Russians weren't doing too well. Basically, we also have the Project 123 BIS as well. I believe this is kind of similar to the one showed in the German tech tree. Doesn't get as good missiles though. Not missiles, as good torpedoes. A lot of these premiums, not really that great. They're basically like, again, another ship with tank guns. Basically kind of like armoured river patrol boats type things, rather than PT boats or ocean-going vessels. That all changes though with stuff like the Project 201 and the Project 204. This thing is absolutely insane. It has absolutely massive rockets at the front. These rockets are absolutely huge. The RBU 6000 mortars. They've got 25 kilos of TNT filler. So if you basically run around the map spamming these at people, if you hit even a light destroyer, it's going to kill it in 1 or 2 hits as it just rips them apart. You get 72 of these, but they reload incredibly quickly as well. You can basically fire all 72 by just holding down the fire button. You're never going to like run into a bottleneck by reloads. You do also get the automatic 57mm guns on the back, Obviously, this gun can't fire forwards. You can only really fire like 50 degrees left or right, which is a little bit annoying. You do kind of have to turn broadside on. I believe they also use turbine engines, which is quite rare. Yeah, 2 turbine engines. Not that that's got anything to do with War Thunder, but quite a cool historical little thing to talk about. You also get this thing, very fast and nimble at 3.3. Not got the best firepower. Decent torpedoes though, quite early ones. Again, when we get to the late ranks, you've got stuff like the absolute cancer machine, the SKR-7 and the SKR-1. Both of them incredibly good. The PR-206M as well. Very, very good vessel. Massive 57mm gun on the back. Does have better firing arcs compared to the Project 204. It is a hydrofoil as well, which is very, very fast. These torpedoes aren't as good. I don't know why there were 2 different sets of torpedoes. They're both 533mm 21-inch. So I don't know why the Russians use so many. I don't really know. I probably should have researched that. But these don't have as good torpedoes as stuff like... I can't remember where they are now. There's a really good Soviet torpedo, which I can't find. Might be on that. No, it's a different one. Anyway, the Russian coastal is incredibly good. Well worth investing. It's just a hard grind to get down here. As you can see, I've not managed to do it yet. Can't really be bothered doing it. I've already got the SKR-7. I bought that premium in a sale. Very, very good ship. Just very low ammunition counts. Got 152 rounds of your 76mm. 2,000 rounds of your 30. So it's a quite good vessel for coastal, but it does run out of ammunition incredibly quickly. Moving on to our blue water fleet, and the Russians basically went to the Italians when it came to designing the destroyers, at least like the mid interwar destroyers. So they have quite a lot of Italian characteristics, which is high speed and unfortunately as well low, very unbalanced vessels. Again, not something that matters in War Thunder, but in real life they had a nasty habit of being quite rolly in seas ways, to put it softly. Anyway, the Russian guns aren't particularly great, gonna be honest. Did you get the high explosive VT shells? Funnily enough, probably post-war. Definitely didn't have HEVT in World War II. Guardians being a little bit loose with the stuff there. They definitely did not have that in World War, especially in 1941 they didn't have it. But the Russians get good when it gets to stuff like the Blagorodony, however you pronounce it. I'm not Russian. I'm British, so I'm going to anglicize everything. Stuff, the 5.3 battle rating destroyers, they don't have a lot of guns. They only have 4 130mm 58 caliber guns, but they do get a fantastic semi-armor piercing round with 200mm of penetration. They also have pretty decent explosive 2 kilos of TNT. So while they don't have the largest broadside in history, the semi-armor piercing rounds do a lot of damage. You also get pretty good anti-aircraft capabilities with the several quad 45mm guns. Pretty high rate of fire, kind of like the British pom-pom guns. They fire slow, but they put absolutely massive amounts of lead into the air. You also have, I believe these also get some pretty good torpedoes as well. That's what I was trying to say. The very good torpedoes that the Soviets have is the 5365s found on the Bravi, which brings us on to our next type of vessel in the Soviet tech tree, and that is the missile destroyer, DDG, I guess you'd call it in the American, or yeah, DDG in the American tech tree, or American classification. Instead of having a second 130mm turret on the back, they replaced it with a 379mm Volna M missile. These are pretty good for taking out both planes and enemy ships. Not as effective as the USS Douglas, as you are obviously facing much larger opponents, but you can basically sit in a cap zone and spam these at people, and usually there's nothing that an enemy can do to stop you, as you obviously cannot shoot down enemy missiles. So it's a very, very good ship, the Bravi. Not really that high in battle rating either. Kind of like the American tech tree, the Soviet destroyers is a high point. A definite downside of the Soviet tech tree though is the light cruisers. They don't even have any heavy cruisers to speak of. The The Soviets caught a bad case of communism and basically didn't build any ships in the interwar period. All of these, I believe, were just random ships built after World War II, when Stalin decided he wanted a navy to compete with the Americans, and as you imagine, that didn't really turn out too well. I believe they did build the Kirovs actually, but they were basically a waste of time. What am I looking at now? The Sverdlovs, post-war design. The British basically retained the HMS, no, not the, they retained HMS Vanguard specifically for dealing with the Sverdlov cruisers. The idea is that if there was a world war, the Sverdlovs were going to go out and raid American and British naval the Sverdlovs were going to break out into the Atlantic and the world oceans and basically raid American and British shipping. And the British said, well, we'll keep a battleship in service just for dealing with them. But obviously, then a certain government came to power and decided to scrap all of the battleships, including Warspite, which was the only crime of the British Empire. Controversial, I don't care. But Warspite should have been retained. I'd have even made her. She should have replaced HMS Victory as the lead of the Royal Navy. Warspite was an absolute beast, and it's an absolute crime that she was scrapped. Anyway, get sidetracked again by my British nationalism. We then move on to the Soviet battleships. These are dreadnoughts again. Basically, this is what happens when you don't really have the best naval designers. Ironically, in War Thunder though, these are incredibly survivable ships, specifically because they don't have any superstructure really. They're basically just 4 turrets mounted on a ship, vessel really. So all of the crew members are at least behind casemate armor. There's very few people basically on top of the deck. This means that enemies can't really hurt you that much with high explosive rounds. As you can see, you will have 1 or 2 people mounted on stuff like this, basically light anti-aircraft guns. Well, compared to some of like the older, well, the more modernized vessels of the same class. So the Paris Commune, sorry. This thing was modernized and they gave it a bunch of guns. So now a load of people are now standing all over the ship, which means they can be killed very quickly with high explosive spam. That's not a problem with these early ships. So actually the early battleships are actually more survivable than the late war Soviet ones. You also get the Novorossiysk, which is a Conti di Cavour. Basically, the Russians got this as a war prize after the Italian surrender, I guess that's the right word for it. Not a particularly great battleship. You also have the Kronstadt, which is a fictional ship which never existed. Gaijin just decided to add it for shits and giggles, I guess. The Soviets basically never had any battleships whatsoever, apart from maybe some British and American battleships which we loaned to them. But the Soviets basically, when Britain got its battleship back off the Soviet Union, they found that the turrets were seized because they hadn't been lubed up. The engine was basically knackered. The Russians just abuse everything, even their own soldiers. But the Kronstadt does get pretty good 12-inch guns. It's classed, I believe, as a battlecruiser, is it? Yeah, for some reason, even though it's not a battlecruiser. Again, Gaijin doesn't know what they're doing. Anyway, the Soviet lineups are very good at 7.0 with stuff like the Kronstadt, the Imperial Maria, the Poltava's pretty good. The Maria's probably better. The light cruiser, the Sverdlov's pretty decent, pretty fast-firing guns. This thing is absolutely bonkers. It's basically a Sverdlov, but they modernized it. How did they modernize it? They added 8 30mm AK-12s on it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. These things are absolutely insane. Try and put it in a quick test drive. It's just a testament to true Soviet engineering. How do we make a ship good? Do we give it more advanced fire control systems? No, we give it absolutely shit tons of 30mm guns. As you can see, we just shoot into the air here. Absolutely nothing is getting through your AA fire. That's a bit of a tangent, but I thought I'd just show it because it is a kind of... The Soviets have a lot of just weird, quirky vessels, but 5.3, 7.0, 6.7, very, very good for the Soviet tech tree. Alright, moving on to the British, and Britain actually has quite a wide array of coastal vessels, mainly because the German U-boats were absolutely destroying us, so we had a frantic dash to find something to counter them. That started in stuff like the corvette, what they call now, the Flower class corvettes, the HMCS Brantford, built mainly by Canadian shipyards. These were basically whaling ships that had guns mounted on them. As you can see, they aren't exactly built to naval standards, probably don't have any internal bulkheads, probably don't even have a second hull or second bottom as well. So these were never designed for, well, the corvettes, they by definition are not designed by the Admiralty or by naval standards. They're basically just civilian vessels with guns added to them. That changed though with stuff like the Flower class or the River class corvette, which basically had, well, River class. Is this I think this is a sloop actually, because it is designed by naval standards. So it's got naval boilers and the naval compartmentalization. Getting sidetracked again with my autistic understanding of naval history. This thing basically isn't a civilian design. You never use this for civilian, but it did basically the same job, hunting down U-boats and providing air cover. So a lot of the larger coastal vessels basically focused on small caliber guns for dealing off U-boats and having quite a good anti-aircraft capability. In the low coastal battle ratings though of 3.3, these anti-aircraft guns can very easily knock out the small PT boats such as like this type of stuff. So they are very, very good all-round vehicles. This is quite a very old Revent 2019. Still good though. You then also have quite a wide array of PT boats, as well as something that we've not seen before yet. We have the motor gunboat. These are basically PT boats, except they don't carry torpedoes. Instead, just having guns on them to fend off enemy torpedo boats. Quite a weird and quirky design really, only really used by the British. And for some reason we've got some Star Wars heavy guns there. Isn't it weird how the British knew that Star Wars existed before it was even out? Obviously these guns were used by... I'm joking, they were used in World War II, then Star Wars used them. Same way that the Stormtroopers all use British submachine guns. Anyway, the Brave Borderer, pretty decent torpedoes, if I can find it. 84 kilometers per hour in the water, pretty good warhead as well. The Peacocks, pretty good vessels. These are classed as corvettes now for some reason. I guess they changed the classifications after World War II, but this would be more of a sloop in World War II. We then have the big boys. You've got the Terra Nova, which is one of my favourite ships. I've had it on test drive for about a month. I've been playing the absolute hell out of it. I basically grinded it all out just by playing itself. You've got rapid firing 3-inch guns. You've got one on the front, one on the back. The one on the back is an American design. The one on the front is a British. I don't know why they used two different types of guns. This is a 50 cal, that is a 70 cal. So they have different fire arcs as well. So if you fired both guns at once, these guns would hit the target first, and these are slower, so they'd hit later on. Absolutely dumb reason. Don't really know why they designed it that way, but in War Thunder, it is a very, very good ship. Going to the Blue Water Fleet, and the early ranks are basically escort destroyers, I guess you'd call them. Basically stuff like the Hunt class, designed not really to, well, they're not fleet destroyers, which prioritized high speed and large guns for defending against other enemy fleet destroyers. Instead, these were again designed to take over from stuff like the Flower class. They're basically for merchant convoy escort. So they've got rapid firing 4-inch guns, not the larger 4.7-inch guns found on British fleet destroyers. They also have quite a wide array of anti-aircraft capabilities for dealing with those pesky FW2000s going around bombing British shipping. So the British early destroyers aren't particularly that good. You also have stuff that we bought from the American. That's a town class. You have Churchill. I'm pretty sure we bought these from the Americans in the destroyers for bases deal. It doesn't look like a 4-stacker actually. Oh yeah, it is. It's a Fletcher class. Just weird. It's the early destroyers, not particularly too great. You've got HMS Eskimo. This is one of the tribals, very famous during the Battle for Norway. This thing absolutely dicked on some of the German destroyers. They did replace one of the rear guns though for some reason. You also have the HMS Abdiel. This thing overtook an American carrier group once in the Mediterranean during the Suez crisis, I believe. Not too happy with that, but we did it anyway because we love some banter. Do you get the incredibly powerful HMS Mohawk? This is a premium, which I'm not too sure if you can still get it anymore. You can probably get it on the Gaijin store. But you basically get 8 4.7-inch guns. These are your large fleet destroyers, designed basically to be driven into danger and come out fighting. They don't really have any torpedoes. You get 4, that's it. So the Mohawks were like your massive fleet destroyers, designed to brawl it out with just gunfire. And then you had the smaller destroyers, which were basically just torpedo boats, really. Britain then gets quite a few post-World War II post-World War II in service. You have the battle class and the, 2 battle classes. I don't think the battle class served in World War II, I don't think. I don't know why it says 1943. I'm not sure that's right. I'm pretty sure the battle class came in after World War II. They might have been designed in 1943, maybe. I don't know. So they're still using the they're using 4.5-inch guns now. These are true dual-purpose guns, so they elevate quite high to 80 degrees, and they do obviously have the HEVT as well. So you can basically shoot down enemy aircraft incredibly easily, just like the American destroyers. Then also have the Doerings, which were true post-war designs. The same 4.5-inch guns used on quite a lot of ships post-war, but this one gets 6 guns instead of the 4 on the battles. Very, very good ships, but nothing too special really. The rate of fire isn't as good as the American 5-inch 38. It's pretty much every destroyer that we're going to look at today isn't as good as any of the American destroyers, but they're pretty decent, the British HMS Doerings. Even the Mohawk with its massive firepower, it's got quite a long reload. It's like 8-second reload compared to the American 4-second reload. So it's the American destroyers truly are massively powerful. But then come on to one of the downsides of the British, and that is its light and heavy cruisers. None of these ships are good whatsoever, really. I guess the Dido is pretty good if you're role-playing as like an escort for an aircraft carrier and you want to shoot down some enemy incoming planes, as you have 5.2-inch HEVT rounds. But against enemy ships, the 5.25-inch guns, quite a slow rate of fire, really. Not really dual purpose in the same extent as the American 5-inch 38s. The class is light cruisers as well, but they're not very survivable. The HMS London is probably your best heavy cruiser, but the British didn't build any heavy cruisers after the 1920s. These were all just modernizations in World War II, and you can really tell compared to like a American or even the German Prinz Eugens. These things were basically not amazing, honest. They have quite a lot of freeboard though. They were very, very tall ships, which again doesn't count for anything War Thunder, but it's just a cool historical fact. We then have a very weird design, the HMS Glorious. Basically 4 15-inch guns at battery rating 6.0. These things were basically turned into aircraft carriers immediately as soon as they were launched, as everyone decided, what the hell do we want a ship with only 3 inches of armor? It was basically supposed to be a light battle cruiser. That was the design plan, but what the hell would you ever use this thing for? I have no idea why it was even put that. It was basically Jackie Fisher. Jackie Fisher had some fantastic ideas. He kind of went a bit senile towards the end and made stuff like the Glorious. Then I also have the Invincible, which again was designed by Jackie Fisher, which actually was a good design for the time. In War Thunder, it's got less armor compared to the Von der Tann, which we looked at in the German tech tree. It also has bigger guns though, 12-inch instead of 11-inch, sorry. Pretty decent firepower. You've got semi-armor piercing and APC rounds. Don't have those good APC BC, but it's a decent enough little battle cruiser, especially if you can get a down tier to 6.0. If you get an up tier to 7.0, you're pretty much a waste of time really, because you're not going to be able to penetrate enemy ships, and enemy 7.0 battleships will be able to go right through you. The first dreadnought in the world, HMS Dreadnought herself. Pretty decent ship, nothing special though now in the meta, as it is 6.3. You are going to be facing the super dreadnoughts pretty much every game, where it really is beaten around like an Irish housewife. You also have the Renown, which was an event vehicle. You can get it pretty cheap on the Gaijin marketplace. This has 6 15-inch guns, but it gets 10 turrets, each containing 2 4.5-inch guns, the same ones that we saw on the Doering class destroyers. They also get the HEVT rounds found on those destroyers. Oh, they don't actually. They only get the HE time fuse. Oh, I stand corrected. But anyway, these get semi-armor piercing. You can basically spam these at enemies, start a lot of fires, start a lot of damage. So when you're waiting for your main guns to reload, you can still spam these guns and do quite a lot of damage. It is a battle cruiser though, made just at the end of World War II, I believe using the guns off the Courageous class as well. Basically took them off the Courageous and put them on these. Kind of what they did to the Vanguard just at the end of World War II. But the armor protection is pretty non-existent, only around 9 inches on the belt, which is nothing at this battle rating. So just be aware, it is a good ship though, I love it. Then also have HMS Hood, which sadly died to a 1 in a billion shot by Bismarck. Almost certainly should not have killed it, but the incoming round hit here, set off the 4.5 inch guns. The explosion of this ammunition went into the main ammunition bulkhead here and blew the rear turret off and snapped the ship in half. The British are quite quirky as they have the powder rooms, or the powder magazines are above the shell rooms, whereas most navies have it the other way around, as obviously the powder magazine is a lot more volatile compared to the shells. In subsequent British design, this was changed, but it's a lot easier to hit this magazine as it is higher out of the water than something like this. So yeah, more artistic naval knowledge, I guess. Not really that useful in War Thunder. I guess you can kill the HUD quite quickly by shooting the rear ammunition because it is a lot more pronounced. The shell room is obviously just a shell. It isn't really flammable. So yeah, the Marlborough as well is also pretty good. Iron Duke class, which I believe was the flagship used at Jutland. Not this one. It was this ship actually, the Iron Duke, which was the flagship, I believe, of Jellicoe. Could be wrong, but I think that was his flagship. Anyway, that's the British tech tree though. You've got mediocre destroyers, awful light and heavy cruisers, but very good capital ships. It's just a long slog to get to these ships, but it is well worth it. The Iron Duke's pretty decent premium. The Belfast is terrible, don't buy it. Diamond, I don't personally have it yet, but it should be a good premium for grinding. But yeah, I'll probably do a separate premium review. Anyway, let's move on to the Japanese. Alright, welcome to the Japanese. We're going to start with the coastal as usual. So pretty much all of these vessels aren't particularly that interesting in my opinion. You've got this thing which uses propeller engines on the back. Kind of cool, but obviously not exactly highly agile, let's put it that way. I've not bought it because it's not really that up my alley. You then have a fantastic 3.3 lineup for the Japanese. So you've got the Chikugo, the Akabono, and the PGO2. This thing's pretty trash, but these two ships are very, very good. I've put a talisman on this because it is such a cool vessel. It looks very modern. It's got a pretty decent sonar dish, which doesn't work in War Thunder. But your firepower is here up front. You've got 2 3-inch guns. Very, very good. Very survivable ship. I guess in the future they may give it some type of missile here. I'm assuming that's what it is. Do also have a 40mm in the back as well. It's not in a stag mount though, so it is unstabilized. You also have the PT-15, which does get a very good torpedo, 120 kilometers per hour, just shy of the Soviet 5365. I don't have it yet, but I am trying to get there. The Japanese is a coastal tech tree that I've only just started trying to grind out, not compared to some of the other nations where I've got them pretty much completed. You also have 2 very, very good ships here as well. You have the Iron Army. This has 6 3-inch guns, so it's a very, very powerful vessel at 4.0. You also have fairly mediocre torpedoes though, only 44 kilometers per hour. Not really that great whatsoever, but this is more of a gun-based frigate rather than a torpedo-based one. The Isuzu as well. This only has 4 3-inch guns, but it's still very, very powerful. The rear turret can traverse basically past this thing. So it has good rates of fire, good angles of fire, pretty survivable as well. But again, I think the torpedoes are quite mediocre. Yeah, same torpedoes. One of the ships that I don't have yet, but I am actively trying to get it after I get the PT-15, as I do want a little light vehicle to go along with my heavier frigate type ships. So going on to the Blue Water Fleet. Now, this is, if you want to grind out the Japanese tech tree, this is going to be quite a slog. The Japanese destroyers aren't very good, in my opinion, to be honest. They don't really have good guns. While they do have high caliber 5-inch guns, the rate of fire on them is pretty awful. They don't have any really useful ammunition. All they have is high explosive and the high explosive time fuse shell. So no semi-armor piercing, no high explosive variable time shell. So against something like the American destroyers, where they've got that anti-fragmentation armor, the Japanese destroyer guns aren't really able to do loads of damage. The reload as well is actually pretty terrible, to be honest, for a destroyer gun. I believe it's like 6 seconds. They have 9.1 rounds per minute, so I believe that is just over 6 seconds. No, yeah, just over 6. I'm not good at maths. Just over 6 seconds. So it's basically half the rate of fire of the American destroyers. So yeah, American destroyers have got better rate of fire, better ammunition. They've got better layout ships as well. The Akazuki is probably the odd one out though. This thing has slightly smaller guns at 100mm, but you do get 8 of them across 4 turrets. You also get pretty decent torpedoes as well. The Long Lance Type 3, which is the best torpedo arguably in the game, with a massive 1000 or 1 ton of explosive in them, compared to the other torpedoes, which usually carry around, they usually have around 300 kilos. These are actually 24-inch torpedoes, whereas most of the other ones are 21-inch or 533mm. But the Japanese had to do one better and go to 24 inches. Most of the destroyers in the Japanese territory are going to be destroyer-based. The Japanese basically had the Kantai Kessen, which was basically they were going to wait for nighttime and then ambush the enemy fleet, the enemy American or British fleet, and basically fire loads of torpedoes into the enemy fleet at night and hopefully knock out a lot of the ships that way, and then finish off the remainder with the capital units. So the most of the Japanese destroyers are going to be focusing on using the torpedoes rather than their guns. In real life, this was fine because they had the expanses of the Pacific Ocean, but in War Thunder matches where the maps are quite small and confined, and you spawn only around 8 kilometers away from the enemy, the Japanese destroyers can't really do that much apart from fire a spread of torpedoes. You then also have the light cruisers such as the Sendai, the Kuma, and the Isuzu. The Kuma is quite a funny name now considering the recent memes. These were basically World War I ships, very similar to the American Omahas in layout. Nothing particularly effective though, in my opinion. You mainly see these ships used by bots, and they are very unremarkable. The Japanese do get some pretty good ships though, like the SAKO. This is a battle rating 4.7 vessel, which does get 6 8-inch guns. You can see here 3 forward and then 3 aft. They do have AP rounds as well. So while you do get 8-inch guns at battle rating 4.7, the rate of fire is pretty bad, but they are very powerful. It's one of those vessels that it's like a wild card ship. It's got a lot of potential to do a lot of damage, but because it's got such terrible armor, an American destroyer can absolutely cleave through you with semi-armor piercing. But it's one of those ships that if you do have it, you can do a lot of damage. It depends on the match really. You can pump out a serious amount of damage if you're a skilled player. So moving on to the Japanese more modern light cruisers, we have stuff like the Furutakas and the Suzuya or the Makumas. These basically have 10 triple turrets with 155mm guns, basically 6.1 inches. They do have APHE as well, pretty good at destroying light and heavy cruisers, as you do basically firing 15 guns at once, which gives you a pretty decent spread of weaponry. These were then modernized in World War II, well, illegally. They were basically designed to be like this really. So they were always heavy cruisers, but the Japanese just gave them 3 6-inch guns as they weren't allowed to build ships this big, but they just designed, you know what I mean. They were always intended to be heavy cruisers, but they designed them as light. Well, they told the British and Americans that they were light cruisers, basically in violation of a treaty. But then World War II broke out and they changed them to 8-inch guns. These guns are very good though. They've got very solid AP rounds, nearly 370mm of penetration. They also carry the Long Lance Torpedo, only mod 2, sorry. Still very good though, they're just not as fast, 5 kilometers per hour slower. I'm sure you won't mind that. They do also have 627 kilos of TNT, so very, very powerful ships. The only downside about the torpedoes in this is that you basically have to turn 90 degrees to fire them. You can't really fire them ahead. So the firing arcs of the torpedoes aren't the best. You also don't really have the best secondary batteries. You basically get 8 4-inch guns. No. Yeah, no, these are 5-inch guns, sorry. They're not very effective though. You only get high explosive time fuse and HE. Basically the same guns found on destroyers. Not particularly effective whatsoever. We then come on to the capital ships though, and this is where the Japanese are a standout star. The best ship in the game currently at the minute is this thing, the IGN Mutsu. It's got 8 16-inch guns, incredibly powerful round, the 410mm number 5 with nearly 800mm of penetration. Absolutely insane range. Also have 12.6 kilos of TNT, and we have HE rounds with 46 kilos of TNT as well. So very good ship. That is the Mutsu, but even the other ships like the Issei, the Hyuga, Kongo, Fuso, Haruna, very, very good ships. Basically, all of these ships, apart from the Mutsu, use the Vickers 14-inch guns, which are still very good. The Hyuga, it is a World War I ship, so doesn't really have many people on the superstructure, like the Imperia Maritza that we looked at in the Soviet territory. You then also have the more modernized vessels, such as the Issei, which basically is the exact same ship, except they added a bunch of superstructure to it, which in-game just makes it more vulnerable to incoming high explosive shells. They also gave it some silly little biplanes, I guess, which almost certainly just got in the way of the firing arc of the guns. But yeah, the Japanese tech tree, in my opinion, is fantastic, and it is probably one of the best nations to play in War Thunder for naval. It's just getting past the destroyers, which is a bit of a slog. The Yamashiro is a pretty decent pick though for a premium if you can afford it, and the Mikuma is still a decent backup even at top tier, as it's got rapid firing 6.1-inch guns and you've got very good torpedoes to go with it. Moving on to the Italians, and this is probably one of the weakest nations in the game for naval, as they don't really have anything good whatsoever really. The best thing is probably the Freccia P493. This is a very old event vehicle, basically just 4 40mm cannons. I don't think you can get it anymore though. Nothing else here is really worth grinding in my opinion. This thing is pretty decent as you can get anti-ship missiles on it. But apart from that, the Blue Water Fleet is basically just the same. None of these destroyers, light cruisers or battleships are particularly good in my opinion. The Italian ships use incredibly weird ammunition and guns. Doesn't really make sense to me, to be honest. The Italians were only focused on basically the Mediterranean though, so all of the ships are rather small, didn't really have good range. They were always scared of being under attack by land-based fighters as well, but they never really had effective anti-aircraft guns whatsoever. They never really had radar either. They basically just weren't really that good of a navy. They were basically still using World War I fire control in World War II. So while the British were using radar range finding, well, the British discovered the Italian fleet at Cape Matapan. They used radar to find them. We basically sailed right up to the 3 Italian cruisers, and they didn't even know the British battle fleet was there because they had no radar. They had no real way of discovering stuff other than the eyeball. But in War Thunder, none of these ships are really that great, to be honest. I tried to grind this. Gaijin gave me this to review once. They just gave it me permanently for some reason. That's why it's there without unlocking them. But yeah, none of these ships are really that great. The Duilio is basically... it looks cool. The Conti de Cavour, it's the same ship that we looked at in the Soviet territory. But even this isn't really that great. You don't really see any Italian ships in War Thunder at top tier because no one can be bothered grinding them. And it's the same for the coastal really. It's just not really worth grinding, to be honest. And then finally we have the French. This is only in the Blue Water territory. I haven't even bothered grinding this as it would be an offense to my ancestors, who almost certainly were in the Royal Navy at some point. I have the Le Triomphant because it was in the Battle Pass and I've not played it, I don't think. No, still got 33 repairs. Still not disgraced my ancestors. You have the Corbeil, which is kind of weird. The French really fell off when it came to ship design. They were pretty good in the Nelsonic area and the Napoleonic era is probably a better way of saying it. But then they kind of just fell off. All of the French battleships are kind of weird. This thing just looks awful. Looks like a civilian vessel with 12-inch guns mounted on it, or whatever these are. 12.2-inch or something stupid like that. There's nothing really good to say about them. I'm not trying to be mean. they're just not really meta. I guess if we got some of the more modern French capital units, like the battle cruisers that they made, which the name forgets me at the minute, but they had 8 guns in 2 turrets mounted forward. I can't remember what they're called though. I can't remember what they're called. Oh, it's going to be killing me. Those ships should be added next though, because they desperately need them. There's no reason to grind the French territory at the minute, to be honest, in my opinion. France didn't really have anything. They didn't really do anything in World War II apart from get bombed by the Germans or scuttle themselves, really. But yeah. Anyway, lads, thanks for watching this very unhinged video. I've been just nailing the gym, just trying to lose weight again. Try and get into a little bit better state of mind. Been working in the garden as well, trying to touch grass quite literally. I'm turfing my garden and leveling it all out. But yeah, that's enough for rambling. I hope this helped you somehow. I know I kind of went on an artistic historical rant in several points during this video, but yeah, hopefully you got a little bit of information out of it. I have, as you've seen, I have grinded out pretty much a lot of these nations as well, so I've got quite a bit of experience playing War Thunder Naval. Hopefully you've learned a little bit of something. You've almost certainly learned about my disdain for French people, but I am English, so you probably already knew that. Anyway, lads, big thank you to my YouTube members as always, and I'll see you in the next video.